Before America learned that legends still walk among us, Sophie Carter thought she was just another desperate cancer patient selling art on a street corner to survive. This is the incredible true story of how one chance encounter with Clint Eastwood transformed a dying girl's last hope into a $1 million career and proved that sometimes miracles come disguised as cowboys. That'll be $50,000. The words hung in the air as 19-year-old Sophie Carter stared at the check in her trembling hands. She'd been selling paintings on the sidewalk for weeks, desperate to fund her chemotherapy treatments. Most people walked by without a second glance, but when a quiet man in a cowboy hat stopped at her stand, everything changed. Because that man was Clint Eastwood, and he had just changed her life forever. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Patel's office hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the white walls as 19-year-old Sophie Carter sat on the crinkled examination table. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing with the distant beeping of monitors from nearby rooms. Sophie already knew what was coming. She had heard that careful, practiced tone before. "The treatment is working, Doctor," Patel said, adjusting his glasses with a small glimmer of hope in his voice. "But you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemotherapy." Sophie barely flinched. She had become accustomed to this routine, the pain, the sickness, the exhaustion that had become her new normal. What she wasn't prepared for was what came next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs," the doctor continued, his voice growing heavier. "Unfortunately, without insurance coverage for the next round, the out-of-pocket expenses will be..." He hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Substantial." Her mother let out a shaky breath beside her. Sophie didn't need to look to know she was fighting back tears. The medical bills had already drained them completely. Their savings were gone, their credit cards maxed out. The previous rounds of treatment had pushed them to the very edge of financial ruin. For the first time since her diagnosis, fear crept into Sophie's chest, not the fear of dying, but the fear of watching her parents lose everything trying to save her. The weight of that burden felt heavier than any tumor ever could. The drive home was silent, her mother gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her father's voice had been hoarse when he promised her that everything would be okay, but Sophie could hear the desperation in his lie. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Sophie's heart pounded as a terrible realization washed over her. She refused to be the reason her family went bankrupt. She refused to let her parents sacrifice their future for hers. But then, in the darkness of her room, an idea began to form. Art had always been her escape, her passion, her way of making sense of a world that often made no sense at all. If she could create something meaningful, something people wanted to buy, maybe she could fight back in her own way. By morning, Sophie had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle to save her life. She was going to create one brushstroke at a time. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic to Sophie Carter. Even now, sitting on a foldable stool beside her makeshift art stand on a bustling downtown sidewalk, she felt that familiar surge of hope as her brush glided across the canvas. The small wooden table in front of her displayed her life's work, neatly arranged paintings, each one a piece of her soul laid bare for strangers to judge. Her mother had helped her set up the stand that morning, but the rest was up to Sophie. It had been her idea, after all. She had spent the previous week pouring every ounce of remaining energy into her paintings, knowing this wasn't just about art anymore. This was about survival. A small, handwritten sign sat prominently at the front of her booth. "Original art, funding my cancer treatment." The words felt vulnerable, exposed, but Sophie had learned that sometimes desperation required honesty. If she could sell enough pieces, if people saw value in what she created, maybe she could afford the treatments that could save her life. But hope, she was learning, was a fragile thing. Pedestrians streamed past in endless waves. Some glanced her way with mild curiosity before continuing on. Others barely noticed her at all. A woman in a navy blazer slowed for a moment, admiring a landscape painting, before shaking her head and moving on. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped long enough to read her sign, his mouth pressing into a tight line of pity before he turned and walked away. Sophie exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The afternoon heat pressed down on her, making her dizzy. It had been hours and she hadn't sold a single piece. Her body ached from the chemotherapy, fatigue gnawing at her bones like a cruel reminder of what she was fighting against. But giving up wasn't an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple approached, the woman's eyes bright with genuine curiosity. "These are beautiful," the woman murmured, running her fingers lightly over the edge of a desert sky, painting rendered in deep purples and streaks of gold. "How much for this one?" Sophie swallowed hard. $80. The woman exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded approvingly. "We'll take it." For a moment, Sophie didn't move. She had rehearsed this scenario countless times, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman handed her the cash, something inside Sophie cracked open with relief. Her first sale, her first victory. She held on to that feeling as she carefully packed the painting, knowing she was just getting started. By the fourth day, Sophie's optimism was wearing thin. Her body ached from sitting on the hard metal stool for hours, her muscles weak from the ongoing chemotherapy treatments. The summer heat felt oppressive, making her dizzy and nauseous. She had sold only 3 paintings total, not even close to what she needed for her next round of treatment. The reality was creeping in like a slow poison. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe no one really cared about the art of a dying teenager. Then, unexpectedly, someone stopped, who changed everything. A young journalist with a press badge clipped to her bag approached the stand, her eyes lighting up as she took in Sophie's work. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward a twilight cityscape painting. "Did you create all of these yourself?" Sophie nodded, barely daring to hope. "Yeah, I did." The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run an online arts blog. I love discovering hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take some photos?" For the next few minutes, the woman documented everything. The paintings, Sophie at her stand, the handwritten sign explaining her situation. Then she asked the question Sophie wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So Sophie told her about the hospital visits, the mounting medical bills, how she refused to let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, taking notes. "People should hear this," she said with conviction. "I'll make sure they do." Sophie didn't think much of it initially. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, something was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman purchased 2 paintings consecutively. A young couple debated which piece to take home. By noon, Sophie had sold more paintings than in the previous 4 days combined. Then, her phone buzzed with a message from her best friend Lucas. "Dude, check this out." He had sent a link to an article titled, "Fighting for Art, Fighting for Life, the teen who's painting her way to chemo." Sophie's heart pounded as she read her own story, beautifully told and shared thousands of times already. At the bottom of the article, she saw something that made her breath catch. Hundreds of comments from people offering support, encouragement, and interest in purchasing her work. This was real. The story was spreading. But even then, Sophie had no idea that her biggest customer was already on his way to find her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as another wave of pedestrians rushed past Sophie's art stand. The city buzzed with its usual energy. People lost in their own worlds, their own problems, their own destinations. Sophie wiped sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness that crept in whenever she sat too long. Sales had picked up since the blog article, but she was still far from her goal. Every dollar mattered. Every sale brought her closer to the treatment that could save her life. Then, without warning, the energy around her shifted. There was a quiet presence, a stillness that felt out of place amid the city's chaos. She felt it before she saw him. A tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't glancing at his phone, wasn't rushing to his next appointment. He stood completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. He was studying her paintings with an intensity that made Sophie pause. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. The man's lips curved into a slight smirk. "Depends," he said, his voice gravelly and unmistakably familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie hesitated. Most people asked about prices, not stories. She studied him more carefully. his lined face, those piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of experience. Something about him felt like an old Western come to life. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink, just waited, letting the silence do the work. So Sophie told him about her diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brushstroke wasn't just about art, it was about taking back her life. When she finished, the man didn't offer sympathy or empty platitudes. He just nodded with understanding, then reached for a painting. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a black and white desert landscape with the silhouette of a lone cowboy standing against an endless sky. "I'll take this one," he said quietly. Sophie felt a familiar flutter of excitement. Another sale, another step closer to her goal. "That'll be $200, she said, preparing to wrap the painting. But instead of reaching for his wallet, the man pulled out something Sophie hadn't seen in years, a checkbook. As he wrote, Sophie couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious cowboy was and why he felt so familiar. Sophie watched as the man in the cowboy hat carefully wrote in his checkbook, his movements slow and deliberate. When he tore out the check and handed it to her, she took it casually, expecting to see $200 written in neat handwriting. Instead, her world tilted on its axis. The number staring back at her made no sense. $50,000. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake as she stared at the impossible figure. This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city noise. The man smiled slightly, tilting his hat back to reveal his face fully. Sophie's heart stopped. Those piercing blue eyes, that legendary smirk, the weathered features that had graced movie screens for over 60 years. She was looking at Clint Eastwood. "It's not charity," he said simply. "It's a damn good painting." Sophie couldn't breathe. People around them began to notice, whispers spreading through the crowd as recognition dawned. Someone pulled out a phone, then another. The whispers turned to excited chatter as word spread. "That's Clint Eastwood." I can't take this," Sophie stammered, trying to hand the check back. Clint's expression was gentle but firm. "Yes, you can. Keep painting, kid. The world needs your story." Within minutes, the quiet sidewalk had transformed into a frenzy. People who had walked past Sophie's stand for days without a second glance suddenly swarmed her booth. They weren't just looking anymore, they were buying. "I'll take this one," a man in a business suit called out, grabbing a cityscape painting. "How much for this piece?" a woman asked urgently, holding up another canvas. Sophie sat there stunned as her paintings, the ones that had been ignored for days, were snatched up one by one. The crowd fed off the energy, everyone wanting to be part of the moment they had witnessed. Clint stood back watching the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. Finally, he leaned down and spoke just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Told you, kid. Just keep painting." With that, he tipped his hat and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as mysteriously as he had appeared. Sophie stared at the check in her hands, then at the crowd of people eagerly buying her art. In the span of 10 minutes, her life had completely changed. The treatments were now affordable, her future was secure, and it was all because a legend had seen something worth believing in. By the time Sophie got home that evening, her phone was exploding with notifications. The photo of Clint Eastwood at her art stand had gone viral, shared across every social media platform imaginable. Headlines blazed across news sites. Clint Eastwood buys teens painting for $50,000, and Hollywood legend helps young artist battling cancer. The video someone had captured of Clint handing her the check had already surpassed 3 million views. Sophie's story was everywhere, inspiring people around the world who saw in her struggle a reflection of their own battles. But the viral moment was just the beginning. Her inbox flooded with messages from art collectors, gallery owners, and people who simply wanted to support her journey. A prestigious New York gallery reached out, offering to represent her work. Commission requests poured in from across the globe. Within a month, Sophie walked into the hospital for her final round of chemotherapy. Every bill paid in full. The crushing financial burden that had once threatened her family's future was gone, replaced by hope and possibilities she had never dared imagine. A week after her final treatment, she received a handwritten letter that made her cry. It was from Clint Eastwood himself, simple but profound. "Sophie, Your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Clint. Sophie's first official gallery show opened 3 months later to critical acclaim. Art critics praised not just her technical skill, but the raw emotion and authenticity that radiated from every piece. Her paintings, born from desperation and hope, now commanded prices that would have seemed impossible just months before. But there was one painting Sophie would never sell, the black and white Western landscape that had started it all. That piece, now hung in Clint Eastwood's private collection, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can change everything. Years later, as Sophie became an established artist known for her inspirational story and powerful work, she would often think back to that moment on the sidewalk. A dying teenager with a paintbrush, a Hollywood legend with a checkbook, and a chance encounter that proved miracles can happen when we least expect them. Her art was no longer about survival, it was about thriving. And every time she picked up a brush, she remembered Clint's words. "Keep painting, kid. The world needs your story." Some stories, Sophie learned, are worth more than any price tag. They're worth a lifetime of telling. What would you do if a stranger changed your life forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Don't forget to hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe if you want videos like this to come. See you in the next story.